This is an audiobook of 1984 by George Orwell, written in 1949, and this is going to be Part 1, Chapter 1, and I will try to read with as much emotion as possible. Part 1, Chapter 1. It was a bright cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Winston Smith, his chin nuzzled into his breast in an effort to escape the vile wind, slipped quickly through the glass doors of Victory Mansions, though not quickly enough to prevent a swirl of gritty dust from entering along with him. The hallway smelt of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. At one end of it, a colored poster, too large for indoor display, had been tacked to the wall. It depicted simply an enormous face, more than over a meter wide. The face of a man of about 45, and a heavy black mustache and ruggedly handsome features. Winston made for the stairs. It was no use trying the lift. Even at the best of times, it was seldom working, and at the present, the electric current was cut off during the daylight hours. It was part of the economy drive in preparation for Hate Week. The flat was 7 flights up, and Winston, who was 39 and had a varicose ulcer above his right ankle, went slowly, resting several times on the way. On each landing, opposite the little shaft, the poster with the enormous face gazed from the wall. It was one of those pictures which are so contrived that the eyes follow you about when you move. "Big Brother is watching you," the caption beneath it ran. Inside, a fruity voice was reading out a list of figures which had something to do with the production of pig iron. The voice came from the oblong metal plaque, like a dulled mirror, which formed part of the surface of the right-hand wall. Winston turned a switch, and the voice sank somewhat, though the words were still indistinguishable. The instrument, the telescreen it was called, could be dimmed, but there was no way of shutting it off completely. He moved over to the window, a smallish, frail figure, the meagerness of his body merely emphasized by the blue overalls which were the united form of the party. His hair was very fair, his face naturally sanguine, his skin roughened by the coarse soap and blunt razor blades, and the cold of the winter that had just ended. Outside, even though the shut window pane, the world looked cold. Down the little street, little eddies of wind were whirling dust and torn apart into spirals. And though the sun was shining and the sky was a harsh blue, there seemed to be no color in anything except the posters that were plastered everywhere. The black mustachioed face gazed down from every commanding corner. There was one in the front, immediately opposite. "Big Brother is watching you," the caption said, while the dark eyes looked deep into Winston's own. Down at the street level, another poster, torn at the corner, flapped fitfully in the wind, alternately covering and uncovering the word "Ingsoc." In the far distance, a helicopter skimmed down between the roofs, hovered for an instant like a blue bottle, and darted away again with a curving flight. It was the police patrol, snooping into people's windows. The patrols did not matter, however. Only the thought police mattered. Behind Winston's back, the voice from the telescreen was still babbling away about the pig iron and the overfulfillment of the ninth three-year plan. The telescreen received and transmitted simultaneously, and any sound that Winston made, above the level of a very low whisper, could be picked up by it. Moreover, so long as he remained within the field of vision which the metal plaque commanded, he could be seen as well as heard. There was, of course, no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment. How often, or on what system, the thought police plugged in at any individual wire was guesswork. It was even conceivable that they watched everybody at all time. But at any rate, they could plug in your wire whenever you wanted to. You had to did live, from habit that became instinct, in the assumption that every sound you made was overheard and, except in darkness, every movement scrutinized. Winston kept his back turned to the telescreen. It was safer, though, as he knew, even a back can be revealing. A kilometer away was the Ministry of Truth, his place of work. towered vast and white above the grimy landscape. This, he thought with a sort of vague distaste, was London, chief city of Airstrip 1, itself the third most populous of the provinces of Oceania. He tried to squeeze out some childhood memory that should tell him whether London had always been quite like this. Were there always these vistas of rotting 19th century houses, their sides shored up with balks of timber, their windows patched with chalkboard, and their roofs with corrugated iron, their crazy green garden walls sagging in the directions, and the bombed sites where the plaster dust swirled in, the air and willow herbs staggled over heaps of rubble, and the places where the bombs had cleared a larger path, and there had been sprung up sordid colonies of wooden dwellings like chicken houses. But it was no use. He could not remember. Nothing remained of his childhood except a series of bright-lit tableaux, occurring against no background and mostly unintelligible. The Ministry of Truth, Mini-True, in Newspeak, was startlingly different from any other object in sight. It was an enormous pyramidal structure of glittering white concrete, soaring up, terrace after terrace, 300 meters into the air. From where Winston stood, it was just possible to read, picked out in every white fence of elegant lettering, the three slogans of the party. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. The Ministry of Truth contained, it was said, 3,000 rooms above each ground level, and corresponding ramifications below. Scattered about London, there were just 3 other buildings similar in appearance and size. So completely did they dwarf the surrounding architecture that from the roof of Victory Mansions you could see all 4 of them simultaneously. They were the homes of the 4 ministries between the entire apparatus of government was divided. The Ministry of Truth, which concerned itself with the news, entertainment, education, and fine arts. The Ministry of Peace, which concerned itself with war. The Ministry of Love, which maintained law and order. And the Ministry of Plenty, which was responsible for economic affairs. Their names in Newspeak: Mini-True, Mini-Pex, Mini-Love, Mini-Plenty. The Ministry of Love was the really frightening one. There were no windows in it at all. Winston had never been inside the Ministry of Love, nor within half a kilometer of it. It was a place impossible to enter except on official business, and then only by penetrating through a maze of barbed wire, entanglements, steel doors, hidden machine gun nests. Even the streets leading up to the outer barriers were roamed by gorilla-faced guards in black uniforms, armed with jointed truncheons. Now there's a little side note at the bottom of my page 4. It says, Newspeak was the official language of Oceania. For an account of its structure and etymology, see appendix. So if you want to know more about Newspeak, Google it or see the appendix. Winston turned round abruptly. He set his features into the expression of quiet optimism, which it was advisable to wear when facing the telescreen. He crossed the room into the tiny kitchen. By leaving the ministry at the time of the day, he had sacrificed his lunch in the canteen. And he was aware that there was no food in the kitchen except a hunk of dark-colored bread which got to be saved for tomorrow's breakfast. He took down from the shelf a bottle of colorless liquid, a plain white label marked Victory Gin. It gave off a silky, oily smell, as of Chinese rice spirit. Winston poured out nearly a teacupful, nerved himself for a shock, and gulped it down like a dose of medicine. Instantly, his face turned scarlet, and the water ran out of his eyes. The stuff was like nitric acid, and moreover, in swallowing it, one had the sensation of being hit in the back of the head with a rubber club. The next moment, however, the burning in his belly died down, and the world began to look more cheerful. He took out a cigarette from a crumpled packet marked Victory Cigarettes, and incautiously held it upright, whereupon the tobacco fell out onto the floor. With the next, he was more successful. He went back to the living room and sat down at a small table and stood to the left of the telescreen. From the table drawer, he took out a pen holder, a bottle of ink, a thick, quarter-sized blank book with a red back, and a marbled cover. For some reason, the telescreen in the living room was in an unusual position. Instead of being placed, as was normal, in the end of the wall, where it could command the whole room, it was in the longer wall, opposite the window. To one side of it, there was a swallow alcove in which Winston was sitting, and shallow alcove, which, when the flats were built, had probably been intended to hold bookshelves. By sitting in the alcove and keeping well back, Winston was able to remain outside the range of the telescreen, so far as sight went. He could be heard, of course, but so long as he stayed in the present position, he could not be seen. It was partly the unusual geography of the room that had suggested to him the thing that he was now about to do. But it had been suggested by the book that he'd just taken out of the drawer. It was peculiarly beautiful book. Its smooth, creamy paper, a little yellowed by age, was kind that had not been manufactured for at least 40 years past. He could guess, however, that the book was much older than that. He had seen it lying in the window of the frowsy little junk shop in a slummy corner out of town. Just what quarter he did not remember, and had been stricken immediately by an overwhelming desire to possess it. Party members were supposed to not go into ordinary shops, dealing with free market, it was called. But the rule was not strictly kept, because there were various things, such as shoelaces and razor blades, which it was impossible to get hold of in any other way. He had given a quick glance up and down the street, and then had slipped inside bought back the book for $2.50. At the time, he was not conscious of wanting it for any particular purpose. He had carried it guiltily home in his briefcase, even with nothing written in it. It was compromising possession. The thing that he was about to do was open a diary. This was not illegal. Nothing was illegal, since there were no longer any laws. But if detected, it was reasonably certain that it would be punished by death, or at least 25 years in forced labor camp. Winston fitted out a nib in the pen holder and sucked it to get the grease off. The pen was an archaic instrument, seldom used for signatures, and had procured one. Furtively and with some difficulty, simply because of a feeling that the beautiful creamy paper deserved to be written on with a real nib instead of being scratched in with an ink pencil. Actually, he was not used to writing by hand. Apart from very short notes, it was very usual to dictate everything into the speakwrite, which was, of course, impossible for present purpose. He dipped the pen into the ink and then faltered for a second. A tremor had gone through his bowels. To mark the paper was a decisive act. In clumsy letters he wrote, April the 4th, 1984. He sat back. A sense of complete helplessness had descended upon him. To begin with, he did not know with any certainty that it was 1984. It must be around that date, since he was fairly sure that his age was 39, and that he believed to have been born in 1944 or 1945, but it was never possible nowadays to pin down any date within a year or two. For whom, it suddenly occurred for him to wonder, was he writing this diary? For the future, for the unborn? His mind hovered for a moment, round the doubtful date on the page, and then fetched up with a bump against the newspeak word, doublethink. For the first time, magnitude of what he had undertaken came home to him. How could you communicate with the future? It was of its nature impossible. Either the future would resemble the present, in which the case it would not listen to him, or it would be different from it, and his predicament would be meaningless. For some time, he sat gazing stupidly at the paper. The telescreen had changed over to strident military music. It was curious that he seemed not merely to have lost the power of expressing himself, but even to have forgotten that he had ordinarily intended to say. For weeks past, he had been making ready for this moment, and it had never crossed his mind that anything would be needed except courage. The actual writing would be easy. All he had to do was transfer to paper an interminable, restless monologue that had been running inside his head, literally for years. At this moment, however, even the monologue had dried up. Moreover, his varicose ulcer had been itching unbearably. He dared not scratch it, because if he did so, it would always become inflated. The seconds were ticking by. He was conscious of nothing except the blankness of the page in front of him. The itching of the skin above his ankle, the blaring of the music, and the slight booziness caused by the gin. Suddenly, he began writing in sheer panic, only imperfectly aware of what he was setting down. His small but childish handwriting straggled up and down the page, shedding first its capital letters and finally its full stops. The 4th of April, 1984. Last night to the flicks. All war films. One very good one, a ship full of refugees being bombed somewhere in the Mediterranean. Audience much amused by the shots of great huge fat men trying to swim away from a helicopter after him. First, you saw him wallowing along the water like a porpoise. Then you saw him through the helicopter's gun sights. And then he was full of holes, and the sea round him turned pink, and he sank suddenly, as though the holes had let in the water. Audience shouting with laughter when he sank. Then you saw a lifeboat of children with a helicopter hovering over it. There was a middle-aged woman, might have been a Jewess, sitting up in the boat with a little boy about 3 years old in her arms. The little boy screaming with fright and hiding his head between her breasts as if he was trying to burrow right into her, and the woman putting her arms around him and comforting him, although he was blue with fright herself. All the time covering him up as much as possible, as if she thought her arms could keep the bullets off him. Then the helicopter planted a 20-kilo bomb in among them. Terrific flash, and the boat went all into matchwood. Then there was a wonderful shot of a child's arm going up, right up into the air. A helicopter with a camera in its nose must have followed it up, and there was a lot of applause from the party seats, but a woman sat down in the prole part of the house, suddenly started kicking up a fuss and shouting. They didn't oughter have showed it not in the front of kids. It ain't right, not in front of kids. It ain't until the police turned her out. I don't suppose anything happened to her. Nobody cares what the proles say. Typical prole reaction, they never. Winston stopped writing, partly because he was suffering from the cramp. He did not know what had made him pour out this stream of rubbish. The curious thing was that while he was doing so, a totally different memory had clarified itself in his mind, to a point where he almost felt equal in writing it down. He now realized, because of the other incident he had done, suddenly decided to come home and begin the diary today. It had happened that morning at the ministry, if anything so nebulous could be said to happen. It was clearly 1100. In the records department, where Winston worked, they were dragging the chairs out of cubicles and grouping them in the center hall opposite the big telescreen in preparation for 2 minutes hate. Winston was just taking his place in one of the middle rows when two people whom they knew by sight but never spoken to came unexpectedly into the room. One of them was a girl whom he often passed in the corridors. He did not know her name, but he knew that she worked in the fiction department. Presumably, since he had sometimes seen her with oily hands and carrying a spanner, she had some medical job in the novel-writing machines. She was a bold-looking girl, about 27, with thick dark hair, a freckled face, a swift, athletic movements, a narrow scarlet sash, emblem of the Junior Anti-Sex League, was wound several times around the waist of her overalls, just tightly enough to bring out the sharpliness of her hips. Winston had disliked her the very first moment of seeing her. He knew the reason. It was because of the atmosphere of hockey fields and cold baths and community hikes and general clean-mindedness which she managed to carry about her. He disliked nearly all women, and especially the young pretty ones. It was always the women, above all the young ones, who were the most bigoted adherents of the party, the swallowers of slogans, the amateur spies and nosers-outs of unorthodoxy. But this particular girl gave him the impression of being more dangerous than the most. Once they passed the corridor, she had given him a quick, sidelong glance which seemed to pierce right into him, and for a moment he had filled up with black terror. The idea had even crossed his mind that she might be an agent of the thought police. That it was true was very unlikely. Still, he continued to feel a peculiar uneasiness, which had fear mixed up in, as well as his hostility, whenever she was anywhere near him. The other person was a man named O'Brien, a member of the inner party with a holder of some post so important and remote that Winston had only a dim idea of its nature. A momentary hush passed over the group of people around the chairs as they saw black overalls of the inner party members approaching. O'Brien was a large, burly man with a thick neck and a coarse, humorous, brutal face. In spite of his formidable appearance, he had a certain charm in his manner. He had a trick of resettling his spectacles on his nose, which was curiously disarming. In some definable way, curiously civilized. It was a gesture of which, if anything had still thought in such terms, might have recalled an 18th century nobleman his snuff-box. Winston had seen O'Brien perhaps a dozen times in almost as many years. He felt deeply drawn to him, not solely because he was intrigued by the contrast between O'Brien's urbane manner and his prize-fighter's physique. Much more it was because he was secretly held the belief, or perhaps not even a belief, merely a hope, that O'Brien's political orthodoxy was not perfect. Something in his face suggested it irresistibly, and again, perhaps it was not even unorthodoxy that was written in his face, but simply intelligence. But at any rate, he had the appearance of being a person that you could talk to, if, somehow, you could cheat the telescreen and get him alone. Winston had never made the smallest effort to verify this guess. Indeed, there was no way of doing so. At the moment, O'Brien glanced his wristwatch, saw that it was nearly 1100, and evidently decided to stay in the records department until the 2 minutes hate was over. He took a chair in some row as Winston, a couple of places away, a small, sandy-haired woman who worked in the next cubicle to Winston, was between them. The girl with dark hair was sitting immediately behind. The next moment, a hideous grinding screech, as of some monstrous machine running out without oil, burst from the big telescreen at the end of the room. It was a noise that set one's teeth on edge and bristled hair at the back of one's neck. The hate had started. As usual, the face of Emmanuel Goldstein, the enemy of the people, flashed on the screen. There were hisses here and there among the audience. The little sandy-haired woman gave a squeak of mingled fear and disgust. Goldstein was a renegade and backsider who once, long ago, how long ago no one quite remembered, had been one of the leading figures of the party, almost on a level with Big Brother himself, and then had engaged in counter-revolutionary activities, had been condemned to death, and had mysteriously escaped and disappeared. The program of the 2 minutes hate varied from day to day, but there was none in which Goldstein was not the principal figure. He was the primal traitor, the earliest defiler of the party's purity. All subsequent crimes against the party, all treacheries, acts of sabotage, heresies, deviations sprang directly of his teachings. Somewhere or other, he was still alive and hatching his conspiracies. Perhaps somewhere beyond the sea, under the protection of the foreign paymasters, perhaps even, so it was occasionally rumored, in some hiding place in Oceania itself. Winston's diaphragm was constricted. He could never see the face of Goldstein without a painful mixture of emotions. It was a lean Jewish face, with a great fuzzy aureole of white hair and a small goatee beard. A clever face, and yet somehow inherently despicable, with a kind of senile silliness in the long thin nose near the end of which a pair of spectacles was perched. It resembled the face of a sheep, and the voice, too, had a sheep-like quality. Goldstein was delivering his usual venomous attack upon the doctrines of the party, an attack so exaggerated and perverse that the child should have been able to see through it, and yet just plausible enough to fill one with alarmed feeling that other people, less level-headed with oneself, might be taken by it. He was abusing Big Brother. He was denouncing the dictatorship of the party. He was demanding the immediate conclusion of the peace with Eurasia. He was advocating freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of thought, and he was crying hysterically that the revolution had been betrayed, and all his rapid polysyllabic speeches, which was a sort of parody of the habitual style of orators of the party, and even contained newspeak words, more newspeak words indeed, than any party member would normally use in real life, and all the while, lest one should be in any doubt as to the reality which Goldstein's specious claptrap covered, beyond his head on the telescreen where there marched the endless columns of the Eurasian army, row after row of solid-looking men with expressionless Asiatic faces, who swam up to the surface of the screen and vanished, to be replaced by others exactly similar. The dull, rhythmic tramp of the soldiers' boots formed the background of Goldstein's bleeding voice. Before the hate had proceeded for 30 seconds, uncontrollable exclamations of rage were breaking out from half the people in the room. The self-satisfied, sheep-like face on the screen, the terrifying power of the Eurasian army behind it, were too much to be borne. Besides, the sight or even the thought of Goldstein produced fear and anger automatically. He was an object of hatred more constant than either Eurasia or East Asia. Since when Oceania was at war with one of these powers, it was generally at peace with the other. But what was strange was that although Goldstein was hated and despised by everybody, although every day, and 1,000 times a day, on platforms, on telescreen, in newspapers, in books, his theories were refuted, smashed, ridiculed, held up in the general gaze of pitiful rubbish that they were. In spite of all this, his influence never seemed to grow less. Always there were fresh dupes waiting to be seduced by him. A day never passed when spies and saboteurs acting under his directions were not unmasked by the thought police. He was a commander of a vast, shadowy army, an underground network of conspirators dedicated to the overthrow of the state. The Brotherhood, its name was supposed to be. There were also whispered stories, a terrible book, a compendium of all the heresies, of which Goldstein was the author, and which circulated clandestinely here and there. There was a book without a title. People referred to it as the book. But one knew such things only through vague rumors. Neither the Brotherhood nor the book was a subject that any ordinary party member would mention if there was a way of avoiding it. In its second mute was the hate rose into a frenzy. People were leaping up and down their places, shouting at the tops of their voices in an effort to drown the maddening, bleeding voice that came from the screen. A little sandy-haired woman had turned bright pink, and her mouth was opening and shutting like that of a landed fish. Even O'Brien's heavy face flushed. He was sitting very straight in his chair, his powerful chest swelling and quivering as though he were standing up in the assault of a wave. The dark-haired girl behind Winston had begun crying out, "Swine! Swine! Swine!" And suddenly she picked up a heavy Newspeak dictionary and flung it at the screen. It struck Goldstein's nose and bounced off. The voice continued inexorably. In a lucid moment, Winston found that he was shouting with the others and kicking his heel violently against the rung of his chair. The horrible thing about the 2 minutes hate was not that one was obliged to act a part, but that it was impossible to avoid joining in. Within 30 seconds, any pretense was unnecessary. A hideous ecstasy of fear and vindictiveness, a desire to kill, to torture, to smash in faces with the heads of a hammer, seemed to flow through the whole group of people like an electric current, turning one, even against one's own will, a grimacing, screaming lunatic. And yet the rage that one felt was an abstract, undirected emotion which can be switched from one object to another like the flame of a blow lamp. Thus, at one moment, Winston's hatred was not turned against Goldstein at all, but on the contrary, against Big Brother, the party, and the thought police. And in such moments, his heart went out to the lonely, derided heretic on the screen, sole guardian of truth and sanity in a world of lies. And yet, the very next instant, he was at one with the people about him, and all that was said of Goldstein seemed to be true. At those moments, his secret loathing of Big Brother changed into adoration, and Big Brother seemed to tower up, an invincible, fearless protector, standing like a rock against the hordes of Asia. And Goldstein, in spite of isolation, his helplessness, was the doubt that hung about his very existence, seemed like some sinister enchanter, capable of the mere power of his voice of wrecking the structure of civilization. It was even possible at moments to switch one's hatred this way or that by a voluntary act. Suddenly, by the sort of violent effort which one wrenches one's head away from the pillow in a nightmare, Winston succeeded in transferring his hatred from the face on the screen to the dark-haired girl behind him. Vivid, beautiful hallucinations flashed through his mind. He would flog her to death in a rubber truncheon. He would tie her naked to a stake and shoot her full of arrows like Saint Sebastian. He would ravish her and cut her throat in the moment of climax. Better than ever, moreover, he realized why he hated her. He hated her because she was young and pretty and sexist, because he wanted to go to bed with her but would never do so, because her round, sweet, supple waist, which seemed to ask you to encircle it with your arm, there was only an odious scarlet sash, aggressive symbol of chastity. Chastity is obviously one's abstain from sex. The hate rose to its climax. The voice of Goldstein became an actual sheep's bleat. For an instant, the face changed to that of a sheep. Then the sheep face melted into the figure of a Eurasian soldier who seemed to be advancing, huge and terrible, his submachine gun roaring and seeming to spring out of the surface of the screen, so that some of the people in the front row actually flinched backwards in their seats. But in the same moment, drawing a deep sigh of relief from everybody, the hostile figure melted into the face of Big Brother, black-haired, black-mustachioed, full of power and mysterious calm, and so vast that it almost filled up the screen. Nobody heard what Big Brother was saying. It was merely a few words of encouragement, the sort of words that are uttered in the dim of battle, not distinguishable individually, but restoring confidence by the fact of being spoken. Then the face of Big Brother faded away, and instead the three slogans of the party stood out in bold capitals: war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. But the face of Big Brother seemed to persist for several seconds on the screen, as though the impact that it made on everyone's eyeballs were too vivid to wear off immediately. The sandy-haired woman had flung herself forward over the back of a chair in front of her, with a tremulous murmur that sounded like, "My savior." She extended her arms towards the screen. Then she buried her face with her hands. It was apparent that she was uttering a prayer. At this moment, the entire group of people broke into a slow, rhythmical chant. B, 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 over and over again, slowly, with a long pause between the first B and the second. A heavy, murmurous sound, somehow curiously savage, in the background which one seemed to hear the stamp of naked feet and the throbbing of tom-toms for perhaps as much as 30 seconds, and they kept it up. It was a refrain that was often heard in moments of overwhelming emotion. Partly it was sort of a hymn to the wisdom of the majesty of Big Brother, but still more it was an act of self-hypnosis, a deliberate drowning of consciousness by means of rhythmic noise. Winston's entrails seemed to glow gold. In the 2 minutes' hate, he could not help but shouting the general delirium, but his subhuman chanting of B, 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 B always filled him with horror. Of course, he chanted with the rest. It was impossible to do otherwise, to dissemble yourself with your feelings, to control your face, to do what everyone else was doing, was an instinctive reaction. But there was a space of a couple of seconds during the expression his eyes might have conceivably betrayed him. It was exactly at this moment that the significant thing happened, if indeed it did happen.